Surviving is not the same as living. Have you ever felt that it's been far too long since you were truly living, and that instead you've only been trying to sustain yourself from one day to the next? You still work, still fulfill your responsibilities, still keep moving forward like everyone else. Yet deep inside there remains a quiet feeling that your life is becoming heavier and more unfamiliar with each passing day. What's frightening is that many people live in this state for so long that they eventually begin to see it as a normal part of adulthood. But through the lens of Carl Jung, this isn't a complete way of living. Jung believed that most people operate through unconscious survival mechanisms. They live to adapt, to defend themselves, to be accepted, and to avoid confronting the darkness within. Over time, all of their psychological energy is gradually consumed merely to survive, instead of truly living as a whole, integrated human being. So if lately you've been feeling constantly exhausted, even though your life isn't exactly falling apart, if you've started feeling increasingly disconnected from joy, emotions, and your own inner world, then perhaps what's happening isn't simply the pressure of life. Perhaps you've been trapped in survival mode far longer than you realize, and this may be the first time you clearly see what's been silently draining your vitality, your peace, and your sense of truly being alive. Part I. Are you truly living, or merely surviving? Many people believe that surviving and living differ only in degree of happiness. But through Jung's perspective, they're two completely different states of consciousness. A person who is truly living may still feel exhausted, disappointed, or even deeply hurt, yet beneath all of that, they still sense an inner current connecting them to life itself. A person trapped in survival mode no longer feels that connection. They may function very well on the outside, but internally everything gradually becomes mechanical. Some people spend years without realizing they're living in survival mode, because from the outside their lives still appear perfectly normal. They go to work on time, reply to messages, take care of their families, complete everything that needs to be done. But look more closely, and you'll notice that nearly every action they take is driven by a silent tension. They don't work because they feel meaning in it, but because they fear falling behind. They don't truly rest, but merely pause long enough to gather enough energy to endure the next day. They don't enjoy free time. Many even feel uneasy whenever life becomes quiet for too long. There's something very few people realize. Human beings don't become exhausted simply because they do too much. Very often what truly drains them is that their nervous system has never genuinely been allowed to leave its defensive state. It's like someone who has lived too long inside a room where the alarm never stops ringing, to the point that even when the sound finally disappears, their body still can't believe it's safe. Jung observed that when people lose connection with their inner life, they begin to live mainly through adaptive reflexes. This doesn't always appear as an obvious crisis. On the contrary, it can even look very stable. It's the kind of person who always has something to do, always tries to keep everything under control, always stays occupied with the next plan. But deep beneath the surface, they don't truly know what would remain of them if one day all of that movement suddenly stopped. Jung once wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What matters here is that survival mode doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's the result of years spent learning how to adapt to pressure, wounds, instability, or prolonged feelings of unsafety. Some people grew up in environments where even the smallest mistake led to harsh judgment, so they entered adulthood permanently braced for failure. Others became accustomed to being strong far too early, to the point that later in life, they no longer remember what it feels like to truly relax. Some have lived in anxiety for so long that they eventually begin to see tension itself as the default state of life. The most dangerous thing about survival mode is this: it gradually steals away a person's ability to naturally experience joy. Someone who lives too long in a survival state is rarely truly present in the current moment. Their mind is always several steps ahead, thinking about what might happen, what needs to be fixed, what must be avoided. Over time, life begins to resemble a list of obstacles to get through, rather than a place meant to be experienced. There's an image that mirrors this condition perfectly: someone who has worn armor for far too long. At first, the armor helped them survive, but after years of wearing it, the body eventually forgets what lightness feels like. At some point, they may even begin to feel unsafe without it. Survival mode works the same way. It was once a mechanism that helped people endure difficult periods, but if a person remains trapped in that state too long, they eventually begin to confuse hypervigilance with safety and enduring with living. Perhaps the clearest sign that someone has been trapped in survival mode for too long is when they can no longer remember who they were before life turned into an endless chain of pressure. They no longer remember what it felt like to wake up with natural excitement, to do something simply because they genuinely loved it, or the last time they sat quietly without feeling restless inside. But sometimes that exhaustion itself becomes the most important beginning, because many people only start to change when their inner world no longer has the strength to continue living the old way. Through Jung's perspective, that isn't a sign of weakness very often. It's the moment when the deepest part of a human being finally begins to speak, saying that life must be more than merely surviving from one day to the next. Part 2. How do you escape survival mode and begin truly living? 1. Stop living as the version the world wants you to become. Many people gradually lose themselves, not because of a great tragedy, but because they've become too successful at being the right person. They fit their family's expectations. They fit their workplace. They fit the social image of someone mature, reliable, and well-behaved. But the longer they live inside that constant adaptation, the more a vague feeling begins to emerge that their life is being operated by a version of themselves that's been edited too many times to fit the eyes of others. Through Jung's perspective, this is precisely the moment when the persona begins taking over a person's psychological life. Jung didn't view the persona as simple falseness. He saw it as a necessary adaptive structure that allows human beings to survive within society. Just as actors in ancient Greek theater wore masks to perform roles before the crowd, modern people gradually learned to construct a social face to be accepted, recognized, and protected from exclusion. The problem is this: a mask worn for too long eventually begins to fuse with the skin beneath it. Many people fail to realize that what exhausts them isn't necessarily that life itself is too difficult, but that they must continuously maintain an image that no longer reflects their true inner reality. Some people were taught very early that their genuine emotions were inconvenient. A boy who cried too much was called weak. A girl who expressed anger was labeled difficult. A child who said "I don't want to" was constantly reminded to behave and be understanding. Over time, people begin carrying out a kind of psychological editing process on themselves. They preserve the parts that are loved and quietly erase the parts that make them appear vulnerable in the eyes of society. That's why so many adults appear highly functional, yet no longer know what they truly feel. In modern psychology, there's a concept known as social performance fatigue. It often appears in people who have lived too long in a state of needing to seem fine. They know how to respond intelligently in conversations, maintain a professional image, and create the impression that they're in control of their lives. But beneath that outer shell, their inner world gradually hardens like land that's been covered in concrete for so long. It can no longer absorb water. Consider William, a man who worked in finance in London, where everything revolved around performance, image, and the ability to endure pressure. For nearly 10 years, William built himself into the image of a calm and capable man. He rarely became angry, rarely complained. His colleagues enjoyed working with him because he solved problems quickly. But one evening, after leaving work late, William sat inside his car for more than 30 minutes without starting the engine. What froze him in that moment was a strange thought that suddenly surfaced. If I stop trying to be this version of myself, will anyone still know who I am? It wasn't a career crisis, it was the moment a human being began realizing he had lived for too long inside an identity constructed purely for adaptation. What's interesting is that society often rewards the persona with admiration. People skilled at wearing adaptive masks tend to succeed more easily in collective environments. They know how to read the room, adjust themselves to avoid conflict, become the image that organizations, families, or communities desire. But the psychological cost of this rarely appears immediately. It emerges quietly, in the form of disconnection from oneself. Many people begin recognizing this through very small moments, walking into a restaurant and taking an unusually long time to answer, "What would you like to eat?" Because for years they've been conditioned to prioritize others' desires over their own genuine needs. Some can't answer what makes you happy, despite having achieved many accomplishments. Others reach middle age only to realize that most of the important decisions in their lives were made to avoid disappointing someone else. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This wasn't merely an inspirational statement, it was a deeply serious observation about one of humanity's most common tragedies. Because most people don't collapse from a lack of effort. They become exhausted because they spent too many years maintaining a version of themselves that society accepted, but that never truly belonged to them. That's why the first step out of survival mode isn't to change your entire life immediately, but to begin seeing the mask you've worn for far too long. This requires tremendous honesty with yourself. Because the persona doesn't only exist in how you appear before society, it also lives inside the sentences you've repeated so many times that you began mistaking them for your true self. I'm fine. I don't need anyone. I'm used to it. I just like being busy. Very often these aren't truths, they're simply phrases people use to keep maintaining the image they're afraid to lose. Removing the persona doesn't mean becoming recklessly rebellious or abandoning all social responsibilities. Jung never encouraged chaotic, purely instinctual living. What he spoke about was the gradual process of reconnecting with the authentic parts of oneself that had been abandoned for too long. Sometimes it begins with very small things, learning to say no without feeling guilty, allowing yourself to rest without inventing reasons to justify it, being honest about your feelings instead of instantly turning them into a joke or a rational explanation. Many people imagine removing the mask as some dramatic moment, but in reality, it often begins through very quiet changes. One day you stop forcing yourself to appear perfect in every conversation. One day you stop trying to please everyone in the room. And perhaps one day you realize you no longer wish to keep living as a character, edited solely to fit the world's expectations. That's when a person begins stepping out of survival mode, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because for the first time in many years, they no longer have to spend all of their energy maintaining a version of themselves that was never truly who they were. But the mask a person wears for too long doesn't merely hide the true self from the outside world. Very often it also prevents them from daring to look directly at the deepest parts within themselves. 2. Stop running from the darkness within yourself. Perhaps one of humanity's greatest tragedies isn't that people carry too much pain inside them. but that they spend nearly their entire lives trying to avoid confronting it. The older people become, the more skilled they grow at covering their lives with schedules, noise, work, and constant movement, to the point that many feel anxious whenever life suddenly becomes too quiet, as though if they stop long enough, they'll finally be forced to face the emotions they've postponed for years. Through Jung's perspective, this is where the shadow begins to emerge. Jung didn't use the concept of the shadow merely to describe the evil side of human beings, as many mistakenly believe. The shadow contains everything a person has learned to reject from conscious awareness: anger, once considered dangerous; jealousy that brought shame; vulnerability they were never allowed to express; wounds that were never given a name. Sometimes the shadow even contains powerful desires for life itself, that a person forced themselves to forget to become the correct version of who they were supposed to be. What matters is this: rejected parts don't disappear simply because people stop looking at them. They continue existing in the unconscious, like a locked basement hidden beneath a house. The surface of the house may still appear clean, orderly, and peaceful, but if no one dares open that underground door for years, whatever's trapped inside will begin decaying in darkness and silently affect the entire structure above. That's why Jung once wrote that one doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Many people today believe healing means learning to become more positive, more optimistic, or better at controlling emotions. But Jung viewed transformation in almost the opposite direction. He believed human beings don't truly mature by trying only to become light. They mature when they finally gain the courage to look directly at the darkness they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Some people make others believe they're incredibly calm, when in reality, they've simply been disconnected from their own anger for too long. Some always appear gentle and understanding, while beneath the surface they carry silent resentment they themselves can't admit. Others spend their entire lives taking care of everyone else, because if they stop for too long, they'll have to confront the emptiness they've spent years covering with constant busyness. What makes the shadow dangerous is this: the more a person denies a part of themselves, the more that part searches for another way to appear. Someone who constantly forces themselves to stay positive may suddenly become irritated by the smallest things without understanding why. Someone who always pretends not to need anyone may feel deeply wounded over an unanswered message. Someone who spends a lifetime avoiding weakness may become obsessed with controlling everything around them, because the shadow doesn't disappear when denied. It merely shifts from dialogue into manipulation. In Norse mythology, there's an image very similar to what Jung described. Creatures sealed underground for too long don't die. They continue growing in darkness until the day they finally break their chains and emerge more violently than ever before. The human psyche works the same way. Emotions left unconscious don't vanish with time, they simply become more distorted the longer they're abandoned in the unconscious mind. Consider Teresa, who worked in media, the kind of person everyone saw as energetic and positive. Her schedule was almost full every week, her phone screen was always lit. Even on vacation, she still answered emails near midnight, as though she wasn't allowed to disappear from the world's movement for too long. Teresa once believed this was diligence, until one therapy session when the therapist asked her a very simple question: when was the last time you sat still without needing to do anything? Teresa remained silent for a very long time. Then, she began to cry, not because the question was difficult, but because she realized she could no longer remember what it felt like to be alone, without immediately searching for something to fill the emptiness that had quietly taken root long ago. In that moment, Teresa began understanding that what exhausted her wasn't only work or life pressure. What exhausted her most was that she'd spent too many years constantly running from emotions she'd never truly dared to sit with. That's why many people remain trapped in survival mode, not because they're weak, but because they've spent too many years living in unconscious avoidance. They keep moving, keep reacting, keep filling themselves with information, work, or chaotic relationships, because silence allows the repressed parts within them to begin speaking. The psychiatrist Irvin Yalom once observed that human beings often fear not death itself, but the truths they've never truly lived. This is also what Jung saw in the shadow. Sometimes what terrifies people isn't painful memories, but the realization that they've lived too far away from their true emotions for far too long. But what's remarkable is this: the shadow doesn't contain only pain. It also contains life force that's been sealed away. Some people learned as children to suppress creativity because they were mocked for it. Others buried their strength because they feared being seen as intimidating. Some lost the ability to speak honestly about their emotions simply because they grew up in environments where expressing inner feelings was treated as an inconvenience. So when people finally begin confronting the shadow, they don't merely rediscover old pain, they rediscover the most alive parts of themselves that had been forgotten for years. That's why Jung believed the journey into the inner darkness is not truly a punishment, but a reunion. Human beings don't heal by destroying the darkness within themselves. They heal when they stop treating it as an enemy. If you truly want to begin confronting your own shadow, start with very small observations. Pay attention to what triggers unusually strong reactions in you. What makes you uncomfortable in ways that feel disproportionate? What do you constantly avoid thinking about whenever you're alone for too long? And most importantly, ask yourself, what part of myself did I have to reject to survive until today? Don't rush to fix yourself. Don't try to become a better version immediately. The shadow doesn't open itself to people who seek to control it. It opens only to those calm enough to look at it without turning away. It may now be clearer why so many people see confronting their inner darkness as a terrifying journey, because it forces them to stop running from themselves after so many years. But if you've stayed with this reflection this far, perhaps deep inside, you're already beginning to recognize something you once tried very hard to avoid. So perhaps today, leave yourself one honest sentence. What emotion, wound, or hidden part of yourself have you remained silent about for far too long? Sometimes the moment a person becomes brave enough to call their darkness by its true name is also the moment genuine healing finally begins, the moment that reveals they've truly started living beyond survival mode. And the truth is this: everything a person tries to bury in the unconscious requires energy to keep suppressed. Over time, the inner world becomes exhausted not only from the pain itself, but from spending far too much life force fighting against itself. 3. Learn to reclaim the psychological energy that's been draining away for too long. Do you realize that modern human beings are actually living inside an invisible economy of energy, a world where not only money is consumed, but where attention, emotion, concentration, and psychological vitality are continuously extracted like resources? Every conversation takes away a portion of energy. Every relationship demands a portion of psychological presence. Every moment spent worrying, overthinking, or trying to stabilize someone else's emotions quietly pulls libido, the life energy within a person, away from the self. Perhaps the most frightening part is that many people were never taught that the inner world also has limits to how much it can endure. Through Jung's perspective, libido was never simply instinctual desire, as many mistakenly assume in psychoanalytic psychology. Jung used the concept to describe the entire field of psychic energy that powers human inner life, the force behind vitality, love, creativity, connection, and the ability to remain present with existence itself. Libido is the living energy that allows a person not only to survive biologically, but to feel truly alive from within. Yet in modern society, many people drain their libido in ways they don't even recognize. This happens especially easily to people with high empathy, because empaths don't merely understand the emotions of others, they absorb them. Someone entering a room carrying silent tension can already make their inner world feel heavier. A disappointed glance can stay in their mind for hours. An imbalanced relationship can quietly exhaust them for months, without them ever being able to name what's happening. The problem is that society often praises this kind of depletion as a beautiful quality. A person who sacrifices themselves is considered mature. Someone who always listens is considered thoughtful. Someone who's always emotionally available for others is seen as admirable. But Jung understood very clearly that a human being cannot continue giving endlessly if their libido has never been brought back to themselves. Jung once wrote that the greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown. This is something many empaths spend years learning. Not every pain needs them to heal it. Not every emotional chaos is their responsibility. And not every collapse requires them to hold things together. This is exactly how libido drains from the lives of so many empathetic people, not through dramatic catastrophes, but through the constant giving away of attention and psychological energy, without ever asking which parts of themselves are slowly becoming empty each time they give. In European existential philosophy, there's a profound idea that wherever a person places the entirety of their spiritual presence for too long, that place eventually begins shaping the destiny of their inner life. Jung viewed libido similarly. Psychological energy always flows toward wherever attention is most heavily held. If a person spends nearly all of their inner life worrying about others, saving others, stabilizing others, eventually their libido leaves the psychological center of their own being. That's why many empaths gradually lose their sense of vitality toward life, not because they no longer know how to love, but because too much of their life force has been spent sustaining the emotional world around them. They become like candles always burning to illuminate others, while never once being shielded from the wind themselves. What makes this even more dangerous is that this type of depletion is difficult to recognize at first. It doesn't cause immediate collapse, it simply leaves people with less and less energy for themselves. Things that once excited them begin feeling dull. They need increasingly longer periods to recover after social interactions. Their minds feel crowded, while their inner world feels empty. This is the point where reclaiming libido becomes essential if a person truly wants to step out of survival mode. But reclaiming libido doesn't mean learning to become cold-hearted, nor does it mean cutting oneself off from the world entirely. Jung never encouraged people to close their hearts. What he wanted human beings to learn was the ability to preserve a portion of life energy for their own inner existence, instead of continuously directing all of it outward. This begins with very small changes. Though for many empaths, they're extremely difficult, learning not to immediately rush into solving every emotion in the room. Stopping the habit of treating other people's peace as a personal psychological responsibility. No longer feeling guilty for needing silence, needing rest, or needing to step away from relationships that continuously drain the inner self. Try observing what happens to your mind after each interaction throughout the day. Some people enter your life and cause your inner world to expand, but some connections leave you feeling as though you've walked away carrying an invisible weight. That's when you must begin asking yourself one very important question. Am I truly loving, or am I unconsciously using all of my libido to keep other people from collapsing? Because in the end, no one can live fully if all of their life energy is constantly flowing outward, without ever finding its way back home to the self. But perhaps the deepest layer of exhaustion doesn't come from how much energy a person has given away. It comes from living too long with the feeling that they must constantly become more than they already are to deserve peace. 4. Stop living as though you must prove you deserve to exist. Some people have never truly rested in their lives, not because their lives have always been too busy, but because deep inside them exists a feeling that's difficult to name. The feeling that they're not yet allowed to stop. Even after finishing their work, they still feel the need to do something more. Even on days meant for rest, their inner world remains quietly tense, like a string that's never been fully loosened. And what's striking is that most of them don't even realize they're living this way. They simply believe it's their responsibility, willpower, motivation for self-growth. But through Jung's perspective, this can sometimes be a sign that a person has lost the ability to exist naturally. This is the deepest layer of survival mode. It's no longer about wearing masks to adapt to society, no longer about avoiding inner darkness or letting psychological energy drain outward. It's the state in which a person unconsciously feels that they only have value when they're constantly becoming something more than what they already are. What makes this psychological mechanism so dangerous is that it rarely appears as obvious suffering. On the contrary, modern society often praises it as ambition. Someone always busy is considered hardworking. Someone who never allows themselves to appear weak is seen as strong. Someone who constantly pushes themselves forward is viewed as disciplined. Yet very few people stop to ask what's truly happening beneath that drive. Jung once wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Very often the obsession with constantly moving forward doesn't come from a genuine desire to live, but from a far deeper insecurity, the fear that if one stops, one will no longer feel worthy. This is how many people are living. They don't truly know how to relax, they simply move from one task to another. They don't truly rest, they only pause long enough to continue functioning more efficiently afterward. And deep beneath it all remains a constant feeling that they must keep proving something to life before they're finally allowed to feel at peace. But Jung understood clearly that a human being cannot live fully if their entire sense of worth depends on what they're accomplishing. That's why individuation isn't a journey toward becoming more extraordinary than others. It's the journey of gradually learning how to exist without constantly having to justify that existence. This is an incredibly profound psychological shift, because for the first time in life, a person begins to understand, I can be imperfect and still have value. I can rest without becoming useless. I can fail during a certain period of life, without that failure making my entire existence meaningless. There's an image in nature that perfectly reflects this state. A tree never questions whether it's earned the right to exist before it blossoms. It doesn't need to constantly prove its worth to the forest, it simply grows according to its own nature. So the first step out of this state isn't forcing yourself to become more positive, nor is it abandoning all ambition. What matters more is beginning to notice the moments when you unconsciously treat yourself like a project that must constantly be optimized, instead of a human being who deserves to live. Try observing your inner reactions on days when you accomplish nothing remarkable, days when you aren't productive, days when you simply exist without creating additional value for the world. What appears inside you in those moments? A natural peace, or a quiet sense of guilt? The answer often reveals far more than people realize about how they truly perceive their own existence. Perhaps one of the deepest moments of maturity in human life is when a person finally understands, I don't need to constantly become more than I already am to deserve to live. Sometimes the deepest healing doesn't come from continuing to struggle to become someone else. but from the first moment in life, when a person finally allows themselves to exist, without endlessly having to prove their worth anymore. Conclusion perhaps in the end, what exhausts human beings most was never that life itself was too difficult, but that they spent too many years living in a state of constant tension, just to survive, straining to become good enough, straining not to collapse, straining to keep everything stable. But a soul was never born merely to endure life. It was born to feel, to connect, to be present, and to become itself fully. Perhaps true maturity isn't when human beings learn how to become stronger against the world, but when they finally stop treating themselves like a battlefield that must be guarded day and night. Because there comes a moment in life when the deepest healing is no longer about trying to become yet another better version of yourself, but about finally allowing yourself to live without constantly remaining trapped in survival mode inside your own existence.